My name is Elaine Estes. In the eyes of my family, I'm a 34-year-old spinster, a failure who shuffles paperwork in a dull government office. They have no idea that my real job is deciding who lives and who dies from a top-secret tactical operations center for Homeland Security. But that night, amidst the clinking of expensive crystal and forced laughter, Mark, my cousin Laya's fiancé, the hero my family worships, tossed a jagged, burnt piece of black metal onto the dinner table. The heavy thud silenced the room. He looked straight into my eyes, smirked with pure condescension, and dropped a sentence that made my blood run cold. Someone like you couldn't save anyone, Elaine. That metal was a fragment from the Redport mine explosion, a tragedy I had personally coordinated via satellite just last week. While he bragged about his bravery, mocking the panicked dispatcher on the radio, he added a final slap to my gender. It had to be a man on the comms. A woman would have vomited the second she saw the fire. Mark didn't know that the man's voice he idolized, the one he claimed was his brother-in-arms, was sitting right across from him, cutting a piece of steak and listening to every single lie. Before I tell you how I destroyed his ego in front of everyone, please comment below with the state you are listening from, and hit subscribe if you believe that stolen valor deserves the harshest punishment. The windshield wipers of my 10-year-old Ford sedan were fighting a losing battle against the Minnesota winter. It was a complete whiteout on the I-35 corridor. For 4 hours, I had been gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned the color of parchment. The heater in my car rattled, barely keeping the cabin temperature above freezing, blowing lukewarm air that smelled faintly of burning dust. Any sane person would have turned back. The weather advisory had warned of hazardous travel conditions, urging people to stay off the roads. But in my family, absence wasn't just an absence, it was an admission of defeat. If I didn't show up to the engagement dinner at the lake house, I would be the bitter cousin who couldn't handle Laya's happiness. So, I drove. I drove with the same tactical precision I used to guide extraction teams through hostile terrain. Only my enemy tonight wasn't a cartel or a collapsing mineshaft. It was the icy judgment of my own blood relatives. Through the swirling vortex of snow, the lights of the Windlow Lake house finally appeared. It was a sprawling structure of timber and stone, glowing with warm, golden light against the blue-black storm. From the outside, it looked like a sanctuary, a Thomas Kinkade painting come to life. But as I pulled into the driveway, maneuvering between the massive Chevy Tahoe and the pristine BMW SUV that belonged to Mark, I didn't feel relief. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. That house wasn't a sanctuary, it was a lion's den, and I was walking in without armor. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes, sharp, dark, and tired, stared back. I practiced my civilian face. I relaxed my jaw, softened the gaze that usually scanned for exit routes and threat vectors. Just be Elaine, I told myself. Just be the boring office clerk. I grabbed the bottle of wine from the passenger seat and stepped out. The wind hit me like a physical blow, cutting through my wool coat. I trudged up the walkway, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. When I opened the heavy oak front door, the wall of heat and noise hit me instantly. The smell of roasting rosemary potatoes and expensive perfume filled the entryway. Laughter rang out from the living room. The easy, confident laughter of people who have never had to hold a dying man's hand through a radio frequency. "Oh, you made it." The voice came from the hallway. Aunt Carol stood there, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She didn't smile. She didn't move to hug me. Her eyes immediately darted down to my feet. "Elaine, please tell me you stomped those boots off outside," she said, her voice tight with that specific Midwest passive aggressiveness that sounds like concern but feels like a reprimand. "We just had the hardwood floors refinished. Salt stains are a nightmare to get out." "I knocked them off, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice low. "Good to see you too." She didn't catch the sarcasm, or maybe she just chose to ignore it. She turned her back to me, walking toward the kitchen. "Well, don't just stand there letting the heat out. Close the door." I closed the door, shutting out the storm. But the chill inside was far worse. I took off my coat, hanging it on a crowded rack where it was immediately swallowed by furs and designer trenches. I walked into the living room, clutching the wine bottle like a shield. The atmosphere shifted the moment I crossed the threshold. The conversation didn't stop, but the volume dipped just a fraction. Laya was posing near the fireplace, a flute of champagne in one hand, her other hand resting theatrically on Mark's bicep. She looked radiant, I'll give her that. The golden child in her natural habitat. Mark was holding court in the center of the room. He looked every inch the hero he claimed to be. Broad shoulders, a jawline you could cut glass with, and that confident, alpha male stance that usually masks deep insecurity. "Elaine!" Laya called out, her tone dripping with sugary insincerity. She didn't move toward me. "We were starting to bet on whether your old car broke down in a snowbank." "The roads are bad," I said simply, walking over to Aunt Carol, who had reappeared. "Here, I brought this." I handed her the bottle. It was a 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley, a reserve bottle I'd spent $200 on. It was complex, aged, and perfect for the prime rib they were serving. Aunt Carol glanced at the label without really seeing it. "Oh, thanks, dear." She took it and immediately bent down, shoving it onto the bottom shelf of a side table, completely out of sight. "I'll just save this for later. We have plenty open right now." In the same heartbeat, Mark reached behind him and produced a bottle of generic red blend, the kind with a screw top you buy at a gas station for $9. "Carol, Jim, I brought the good stuff," he boomed, flashing a winning smile. Aunt Carol's face lit up as if he'd handed her a diamond. "Oh, Mark, you shouldn't have. Jim, get the corkscrew. Let's open Mark's wine right now so it can breathe." I stood there, my hands empty, watching my thoughtfully chosen gift gather dust while they celebrated mediocrity. It was a perfect metaphor for my entire existence in this family. "Dinner is served," Uncle Jim announced, emerging from the dining room. We all migrated to the massive mahogany table. It was beautifully set with fine china and polished silver. I watched as everyone found their places. Name cards were set out, Mark at the head, Laya to his right, Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim on either side. I walked around the table, looking for my name. I found it at the very end, but there wasn't a real dining chair there. Because the table was full, they had unfolded a metal card table chair and placed it at the corner, creating an awkward, jutting addition to the perfect rectangle. It was the kids' table spot, except there were no kids. It was just me. To make matters worse, the spot was directly next to the sliding glass patio doors. The seal on the door was old, and I could feel a steady, freezing draft slicing through the gap, hitting me right in the kidney. I sat down on the cold metal chair. It creaked loudly, drawing a few glances before everyone turned their attention back to Mark. "To the happy couple," Uncle Jim toasted, raising his glass of cheap wine. "To the hero," Aunt Carol chimed in, beaming at Mark. I didn't have a wine glass. They had forgotten to set one for me. I reached for the water pitcher, poured myself a glass of lukewarm tap water, and raised it silently. From my cold corner, shivering slightly as the blizzard howled against the glass inches from my arm, I watched them. I watched Mark preen. I watched Leia gloat. I activated my training. I stopped being the cousin. I became the operator. I began to observe the exits, the body language, and the lies. If they wanted me to be invisible, fine. But they forgot one thing about invisible things. You never see them coming until it's too late. The prime rib was actually cooked perfectly, medium rare, pink in the center, swimming in a pool of rich au jus. But as I watched Mark sawing into his slab of meat, pointing his steak knife at Uncle Jim to emphasize a point, I found myself losing my appetite. Dinner had officially begun, and so had the Mark show. "It's all about leverage, Jim," Mark was saying, his voice booming across the table, drowning out the soft jazz playing in the background. "You can't just play the market, you have to disrupt it. My firm is looking at a 7-figure contract by the end of Q3. We're talking about total vertical integration." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tap water. 7-figure contract. That was interesting, considering I had run a standard background check on him 3 days ago when Laya first mentioned his name. The firm he was talking about was an LLC registered to a P.O. box in a strip mall, and his credit score was hovering somewhere around the freezing point of water. He had maxed out 3 credit cards and was currently driving a leased BMW he was 2 months behind on payments for. But Uncle Jim was eating it up. He nodded enthusiastically, a piece of potato falling from his fork. "That's incredible, son. You've always had a head for business. Real risk taker." "High risk, high reward, Jim. That's the motto," Mark said, winking at Laya. Laya beamed, basking in the reflected glory of her fiancé's imaginary success. She looked around the table, her eyes landing on me. Her smile didn't fade, but it sharpened. It was the look of a predator who just spotted a wounded gazelle. She needed to elevate Mark even higher, and the easiest way to do that was to stand on my neck. "Speaking of work," Laya chirped, her voice pitching up an octave. "Elaine, how are things at— where is it again? The Department of Agriculture?" "Homeland Security," I corrected quietly, cutting a small piece of meat. "Administration." Right, administration," she giggled, waving her hand dismissively. "I heard from Mom that you had a terrible week. Didn't the big Xerox machine on the 3rd floor break down again? Mom said you were just so stressed out about a paper jam." The table went quiet. All eyes turned to me. Mark smirked, leaning back in his chair, twirling his wine glass. Aunt Carol sighed, a sound filled with theatrical pity. "Oh, honey, that sounds frustrating. But not everyone is built for the high-pressure world like Mark. Some people just need a quiet, steady pace. It's good that you know your limits, Elaine. Stress can be so bad for your complexion." My hand paused mid-air. Stress? They thought I was stressed about a paper jam. My mind flashed back to exactly 1 week ago. Tuesday. 02 hours, Chicago. I wasn't standing in front of a photocopier. I was in the Tactical Command Center, staring at 6 monitors streaming live feeds from body cameras. I was the primary operator for a joint task force raid on a warehouse suspected of housing a chemical weapon stockpile. "Alpha Team, hold position," I had commanded, my voice steady in the earpieces of 12 men stacking up against a steel door. "Breach in 3, 2, 1. On my screen, a flashbang detonated. White light, smoke, screaming. Gunfire erupted, short, controlled bursts. My heart rate monitor showed I was sitting at 62 beats per minute. Calm, cold, calculated. Officer down, a voice crackled over the comms. "Stabilize him, Bravo Team. Alpha, push left, clear the fatal funnel." "Do not stop," I ordered, simultaneously coordinating a medevac chopper and rerouting local police units to set a perimeter. I held the lives of 20 men in my hands. I guided them through the smoke, calling out targets, watching their backs from the sky. I didn't blink for 45 minutes. That was stress. The memory faded, and I was back in the dining room. The smell of gun smoke was replaced by the scent of roasted garlic. The screaming was replaced by Laya's light, mocking laughter. "So?" Laya pressed, leaning forward. "Did you get the paper jam fixed, or did you have to call IT?" I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the insecurity behind the heavy makeup. I saw the desperation to be better than me. "I managed, Laya," I said, my voice low and even. "I enjoy working with machines. They're predictable." I turned my gaze to Mark. He was looking at me with a mixture of boredom and amusement, like I was a bug he was about to squash. "Besides," I added, holding his gaze just a second too long, "at least the photocopier doesn't lie about its performance." The silence that followed was heavy. Uncle Jim frowned, confused. Aunt Carol blinked rapidly. "Well, that's an odd thing to say." Mark's smirk faltered. For a microsecond, the alpha male mask slipped. He shifted in his chair, sensing a threat he couldn't identify. I wasn't playing the role of the submissive, embarrassed cousin. I wasn't looking at the floor. I was looking right through him. "Machines are boring," Mark said quickly, his voice a little louder than necessary, trying to regain control of the room. People are where the real action is, leading men into the fire. That's what matters." He was baiting me. He wanted to drag the conversation back to his turf. where he was the hero and I was the nobody. I went back to cutting my steak, slicing it with surgical precision. If you say so, Mark. Before we see just how far Mark is willing to go to prove he's a hero, I have a question for you. Have you ever sat at a table like this? Have you ever had to bite your tongue while someone completely incompetent lectured you on how the world works, just to keep the peace? If you know this feeling, hit that like button right now. It helps more than you know. And I want to hear your story. Comment below with the word silence if you've ever had to hide your true strength to protect someone's fragile ego. Let's see how many of us are out there. Mark cleared his throat, clearly annoyed that I had ended the interaction on my terms. He took a large gulp of wine, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, a crack in his refined facade. He needed a win. He needed a story that would bury me completely. You know, Mark started, his voice taking on a somber, theatrical tone. Talking about fire, it reminds me of Redport. That night changed me. Leia gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh, honey, are you sure you want to talk about it? It's so traumatic for you. I have to, Mark said, looking bravely around the table. People need to know what real sacrifice looks like. I gripped my fork. Here it comes, the main event. The lie that would end his life as he knew it. Come on, Mark, Uncle Jim urged, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, his eyes wide with a mixture of morbid curiosity and hero worship. Tell us about it. Tell us about Redport. The news only showed the smoke, but we know the real story was on the ground. The word hung in the air like a foul smell. Redport. Mark set his wineglass down slowly. He did it with the practiced gravity of a man about to deliver a sermon. He looked down at his plate, then up at the ceiling, letting out a long, shuddering breath. It was a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera award. I don't usually like to talk about it, Mark said softly, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that forced everyone to lean in. It takes a piece of you, you know? Seeing hell on earth. We know you're humble, honey, Aunt Carol cooed, reaching out to pat his hand. But people need to know. True bravery is so rare these days. I picked up my steak knife. The handle was cold, solid silver. I gripped it until the intricate patterns engraved in the metal dug into my palm. It was chaos, Mark began, his eyes unfocusing as if he were seeing ghosts. The initial blast took out the main generator. We were in total darkness. And then, the fire. You've never seen fire like that, Jim. It was 20, maybe 30 feet high. It was roaring like a freight train. It wasn't just burning, it was consuming everything. Steel beams were melting like wax candles. Liar! The word screamed in my head. I didn't see fire that night. I saw data. My mind instantly superimposed the memory over the dining room table. The warm yellow light of the chandelier vanished, replaced by the cool blue glow of the Tactical Operations Center, TOC, in DC. I remembered the screen. It was a high-resolution thermal feed from a Predator drone circling at 20,000 feet. On my monitor, the fire wasn't red or orange. It was a bloom of blinding white saturation against the gray background of the industrial park. And Mark's team? They weren't heroes charging into the inferno. They were 6 tiny, distinct heat signatures huddled together in the loading dock B, completely stationary. They looked like frightened mice paralyzed by a snake. The heat was so intense it singed my eyebrows off through the mask, Mark continued, gesturing wildly. But I knew we had civilians trapped in Sector 4. My guys, they were hesitating. I don't blame them. It looked like a suicide mission. But I looked at them and said, not on my watch. I led the charge. I took a bite of potato, but it tasted like ash. You didn't lead anything, I thought, the memory sharp and violent. On the thermal feed, I had watched Delta 9, Mark's unit, start to break formation. They were scattering. 2 of the heat signatures were actually moving toward the secondary chemical tanks, the ones containing liquid chlorine. If those tanks breached, the gas would turn their lungs into liquid in seconds. Delta 9, hold position, I had screamed into my headset that night, my voice cutting through the static. You are moving into a hazmat kill zone. Turn around. Now. But at the dinner table, Mark was painting a different picture. I couldn't see anything, Mark said, shaking his head dramatically. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but I had this feeling. Call it instinct, call it a gut check. I just knew the way out. I felt a draft on my left cheek, and I knew that was the fresh air. I grabbed the rookie by his vest, and I dragged him. I navigated that maze by pure instinct, Jim. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. Instinct. If he had followed his instinct, he and his entire team would be dead bodies in body bags right now. I remembered the schematics overlay on my second monitor. I had the blueprints of the Redport facility open. I saw what he couldn't see. The draft he felt wasn't fresh air. It was the intake from the ventilation system that was sucking the fire directly into the hallway he was trying to enter. Delta 9, do not go left, I had commanded, my voice dropping into that specific register we're trained to use, the voice of God tone that overrides panic. The corridor to your left is structurally compromised. The roof is collapsing in 10 seconds. Hard right. Go right, 30 meters to the service hatch. I watched on the screen as the heat signatures paused, confused, terrified. And then, slowly, they turned right. 4 seconds later, the thermal bloom on the left expanded violently as the roof collapsed exactly where Mark had wanted to go with his gut feeling. I saved his life. Me. The office clerk, sitting across from him. But the worst part, Mark said, his voice cracking with emotion, was the silence. He took a long drink of wine, letting the suspense build. Laya was squeezing his arm, tears welling up in her eyes. Even Uncle Jim looked somber. What do you mean, silence? Laya whispered. The comms, Mark said, shaking his head. About 10 minutes in, right when things got really bad, the radio went dead. Command Center lost the signal. The satellite link was severed by the atmospheric interference from the chemical fire. I stopped chewing. I stared at him. This was a bold one. This was a lie that could be easily fact-checked if anyone at this table had a brain cell dedicated to critical thinking. Total radio silence, Mark emphasized, looking haunted. I was pressing the talk button, screaming for backup, but there was nothing. Just static. I realized then that no one was coming to save us. No one was watching. I was the commander, the navigator, and the savior. I had to make the call to blow the blast doors myself, with zero intel. My grip on the silver knife tightened so hard my hand began to shake. The comms never went down. Not for a second. The DHS satellite link is military-grade, encrypted, and redundant. We don't lose signal because of smoke. I heard everything. I heard him hyperventilating. I heard him sobbing. I heard him say, and I quote, "Oh God, oh Jesus, I don't want to die, Mom. I'm sorry." I was the one who stayed on the line. I was the one who kept talking to him, my voice steady as a metronome, counting down the meters, telling him exactly where to place his feet. I was the one who authorized the remote detonation of the blast doors because his hands were shaking too much to punch in the keypad code. You must have felt so alone, Aunt Carol whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. My God, Mark. To have the courage to lead when the world has abandoned you. That's what makes a true man. It was hard, Mark admitted, bowing his head modestly. But when the radio died, I found my own voice. I looked at the piece of black metal sitting on the table, the souvenir he had thrown down earlier. He claimed it was a trophy of his leadership. In reality, it was a piece of debris from the door I opened for him. He wasn't just stealing valor, he was erasing me. He was taking the most intense, professional, life-saving performance of my career and turning it into a campfire ghost story where he was the knight and I didn't even exist. Well, Uncle Jim said, raising his glass again, to Mark, the man who doesn't need a command center to tell him how to be a hero. To Mark, everyone chorused. I didn't raise my glass of water. I couldn't. If I moved my hand, I might have thrown the steak knife right into the drywall next to his head. Mark basked in the praise, his ego fully inflated. But he wasn't done. He had to twist the knife one more time. He looked at me, a strange patronizing glint in his eye. You know, he said, pointing his fork at me, Whatever guy was on the radio before the signal cut out, he was good. For the first few minutes anyway, sounded like an old salt, probably a Vietnam vet or something. Deep voice, gritty. My heart stopped. He remembered the voice, but his misogynistic brain had rewritten the audio files in his memory. A man? Laya asked. How do you know? Oh, you can tell, Mark laughed, leaning back. There's a certain authority, a weight. You don't get that kind of steel in a woman's voice. It's biology. The table chuckled. I looked at him, and for the first time that night, a cold, terrifying calm washed over me. The anger didn't leave, it just froze into something sharp and deadly. So, you think I'm an old man, Mark? I thought, my internal voice matching the pitch and timbre of the operator he worshipped. Let's see how you handle meeting him. He was a ghost, Mark said, leaning back in his chair, swirling the cheap red wine in his glass as if it were a 50-year-old scotch. That's the only way I can describe him. A ghost in the machine. The dinner table was captivated. Even the wind howling against the sliding glass door seemed to fade into the background, drowned out by the sheer gravitational pull of Mark's fabrication. Tell us about him, Laya urged, her eyes wide, chin resting on her hands. She looked like a child listening to a bedtime story, completely oblivious to the fact that the dragon in the story was sitting right next to her, and the knight she was swooning over was the damsel in distress. Well, Mark began, narrowing his eyes as if scanning a distant horizon. Like I said, the signal was choppy before it cut out completely. But this guy, he didn't panic. Not for a second. His voice was deep, gravelly. You know that sound, Jim? The sound of a man who smoked 2 packs a day for 30 years and shouted over the roar of C-130 engines. Uncle Jim nodded solemnly. A real command voice. I know the type. Exactly. Mark pointed a finger at him. He sounded like he'd been eating concertina wire for breakfast, probably special forces, maybe a retired ranger working as a contractor. You don't get that kind of steel in your throat from working a desk job. That's forged in the trenches. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. Under the tablecloth, my fingernails were digging into my palms so hard I thought I might draw blood. Gravelly, deep, steel. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to stand up and scream until the crystal chandelier shattered. It wasn't testosterone. It wasn't cigarettes. It wasn't eating wire. It was technique. It's called tactical voice modulation. It was the first thing they taught us in the Level 5 operator course at Quantico. When you are speaking to men in a high-stress environment, men who are pumped full of adrenaline and cortisol, you cannot sound frantic. You cannot sound high-pitched. High frequencies trigger an instinctive panic response in the human brain. So, we train. We learn to drop our larynx. We learn to speak from the diaphragm, pushing the air up through a relaxed throat to create resonance. We strip away emotion. We strip away gender markers. We become a genderless, emotionless entity of pure authority. That gravel he heard wasn't a lifetime of combat experience. It was me, sitting in an ergonomic chair in DC, consciously lowering my register to 90 hertz so that Mark wouldn't hyperventilate and pass out. We had this connection, Mark continued, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. It's hard to explain to civilians. It's the brotherhood. Even though we were thousands of miles apart, we were in the trench together. I'd say, Delta lead moving north, and he'd come back with, copy that, Delta lead, watch your 6. We were finishing each other's sentences. We were perfectly in sync, 2 warriors dancing through the fire. In sync? My mind flashed back to the audio log from 02:14 a.m. that night. Mark, sobbing, breathless. I can't see. Oh God, oh Jesus, Mom, I don't want to die here. Please, someone help me. Me. Voice dropped, flat, authoritative. Delta lead, cease transmission, control your breathing, inhale for 4, exhale for 4, do it now. Mark, whimpering. It's too hot, I'm gonna burn. Me. You are not going to burn. You are going to listen to my voice. Stand up, soldier, stand up. There was no dancing, there was no brotherhood. There was a terrified man-child crumbling under pressure, and a woman holding him together with nothing but the sheer force of her will transmitted over a satellite uplink. But here, in this warm, expensive dining room, I was being erased. Every word Mark spoke was a brick in the wall he was building to shut me out. He was taking my competence, my training, my literally life-saving intervention, and grafting it onto the imaginary body of a retired ranger because his fragile ego couldn't handle the truth that a woman in a cardigan saved his life while he cried for his mother. "It's amazing," Aunt Carol sighed, shaking her head. "It's like a movie." "It's better than a movie," Laya corrected her mother. She turned to look at me, her expression shifting from awe to a sickly sweet pity. "See, Elaine," Laya said, tilting her head. "This is what I was trying to tell you earlier. There's a whole world out there that people like Mark operate in. It's a world of instinct and brotherhood. Those men, they have a language you and I just can't understand. It's primal." She reached out and patted my arm, a gesture so patronizing it felt like a slap. "You have your little forms to file," Laya continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "And you worry about your printers and your lunch breaks. And that's fine. We need people like you to keep the lights on. But you have to admit, hearing Mark talk, doesn't it make you realize how small that office life is?" "Small," I repeated, the word tasting like copper in my mouth. "Yes, small," Laya nodded. "Safe, boring. You should be grateful there are men like Mark and his radio friend out there protecting us so you can sleep at night." I looked at Mark. He was beaming at Laya, soaking up her adoration. He believed it. That was the most terrifying part. He had told the lie so many times in the last week that he had actually overwritten his own memory. He truly believed he had bonded with a brother that night. To the unknown soldier on the radio, Mark proposed a toast, raising his glass high. "Wherever he is tonight, I hope he's enjoying a stiff drink and a cigar. He earned it." "To him," Uncle Jim echoed. "To him." Aunt Carol and Leia chimed in. I stared at the water in my glass. The ice had melted. It was just stagnant, lukewarm liquid. I picked up the glass. My hand was steady. Rock steady. The same hand that had guided a Hellfire missile strike 3 months ago without a tremor. I brought the glass to my lips and drank. The water went down hard, fighting against the lump of rage in my throat. It tasted bitter, like bile and injustice. They were toasting me. They were praising me. But they were doing it by celebrating a man who didn't exist, while looking right through the woman who did. I set the empty glass down on the table. Clack. The sound was louder than I intended. It cut through the murmurs of agreement. Mark looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly. He sensed something. The air pressure in the room had changed. The boring office cousin wasn't shrinking away. I was sitting up straighter. My shoulders were back. My chin was up. I wasn't the cousin anymore. I was the operator assessing a threat. And the threat assessment was complete. Protocol dictated de-escalation. But protocol didn't apply to stolen valor. Protocol didn't apply to a man who would spit on the person who saved him just to get a round of applause. Mark reached into the pocket of his blazer. I knew what was coming next. I had seen the outline of it against the fabric of his jacket when he walked in. "Actually," Mark said, his voice taking on a new, darker tone, "I have something to show you. Something that proves everything I just said." He pulled his hand out of his pocket. The prop. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the fight that was about to begin. He was going to show them the proof of his heroism. He had no idea he was about to put the smoking gun of his cowardice right on the dinner table. Mark's hand emerged from his blazer pocket. He wasn't holding a medal. He wasn't holding a photo. He was gripping a jagged, twisted lump of black material that looked like it had been chewed up and spit out by a dragon. "You want to know what real pressure feels like?" Mark asked, his voice low and dangerous. He didn't hand it to me. He didn't place it gently on the table. He tossed it. Thud. The sound was heavy, dead, and jarring against the delicate clink of silverware and crystal. The object hit the pristine white Irish linen tablecloth about 2 feet in front of me. Momentum carried it forward. It slid across the fabric with a harsh, scratching sound. leaving a faint streak of soot and ash in its wake, before coming to a stop inches from my water glass. "Mark!" Aunt Carol gasped, her eyes widening as she looked at the black smear on her heirloom tablecloth. "The linen." "Relax, Carol," Mark said, not taking his eyes off me. "It's just a little carbon. It washes out. But the scars? Those don't wash out." I looked down at the object. It was a piece of metal, about the size of a man's hand. The edges were razor-sharp, torn violently, rather than cut. The surface was scorched matte black, with patches of iridescent blue and purple oxidation, the telltale sign of metal that has been subjected to extreme, sudden heat. It smelled. Even over the aroma of the prime rib and the garlic mashed potatoes, I could smell it. It was the scent of ozone, burnt chemicals, and destruction. It was the scent of a crime scene. "Go ahead," Mark goaded, nodding at the jagged scrap. "Pick it up, Elaine. Touch it." I didn't move. I just stared at it. "Too dirty for you?" he sneered. "I guess it doesn't match your manicure. That right there. That is what men like me face while you're filing your TPS reports and complaining about the break room coffee." Laya shuddered theatrically. "It looks terrifying, Mark. Why do you keep it?" "It's my lucky charm," Mark said, leaning forward, his shadow falling over my plate. "It reminds me of the moment I realized I was alive. It reminds me that there is a world of wolves and a world of sheep. And the sheep? Well, they just graze." He picked up his wine glass again, swirling the liquid, looking at me with absolute contempt. "You see, Elaine," he continued, his tone shifting from aggressive to patronizingly educational. "I threw that on the table because you need a reality check. You sit there with your little comments about photocopiers not lying, acting like you have some kind of moral high ground. But look at that metal. That's reality. That is twisted steel. That is fire." He gestured vaguely with his steak knife. That piece of shrapnel was flying through the air at 300 miles an hour. It missed my head by inches. If I hadn't moved when I did, if I hadn't had those reflexes. He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "You're a hero, babe," Laya whispered, reaching out to stroke his arm. Mark soaked it up, then turned his focus back to me for the kill shot. "The point is, Elaine," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You live in a bubble, a safe, climate-controlled, fluorescent-lit bubble. You deal with paper cuts. I deal with shrapnel. You deal with jammed drawers. I deal with jammed exits in a burning inferno." He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "So don't sit there and judge me," he hissed. "Because when the chips are down, when the fire starts, someone like you couldn't save anyone. You'd freeze, you'd panic, you'd be dead weight. Someone like you couldn't save anyone." The words hung in the air, heavier than the metal on the table. I looked at Aunt Carol. She was busy trying to discreetly rub the soot mark off the tablecloth with her thumb, avoiding my eyes. Uncle Jim was nodding in agreement with Mark's assessment of my uselessness. Laya was looking at me with that smirk, that triumphant, pitying smirk that said, "Finally, you know your place." My hand moved. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out. "Careful," Mark warned with a laugh. "It's sharp. Don't cut your soft hands." I ignored him. My fingers closed around the cold, rough metal. I lifted it. It was heavy, high-grade industrial steel alloy. I turned it over in my hand, inspecting it not with the awe of a civilian, but with the forensic eye of a level 5 operator. I saw the shear pattern on the edge. The metal hadn't just been torn, it had been sheared by a localized, high-velocity pressure wave. I saw the microscopic pitting on the surface. That wasn't just fire damage, that was chemical corrosion accelerated by heat, chlorine gas reaction. And then, I saw it. On the underside, partially obscured by soot but still legible to anyone who knew what to look for, was a partial serial number stamped into the steel. LB3 Elkin Soy. My heart didn't speed up, it slowed down. The world seemed to sharpen into crystal clarity. LB3 LK. Sector B3. Lock mechanism. I knew this piece of metal. I knew it intimately. At 2:18 a.m. that night, Mark had been screaming that the door was jammed. He was pulling on the handle of the Sector B3 blast door, panic making him useless. He was trapped. The fire was behind him. The gas was rising. I was the one who pulled up the schematics. I was the one who realized the manual override was melted. I was the one who accessed the facility's remote failsafe system. I remembered my command clearly. Delta Lead, get clear of the door. Move back 5 meters. I'm initiating a remote blowout of the locking bolts. Fire in the hole. I had typed the command sequence. I had pressed execute. The shaped charges built into the frame specifically for emergency egress had detonated. The locking bolts were sheared off instantly. The door swung open, this jagged, ugly lump of metal in my hand. This wasn't shrapnel that missed his head by inches. This wasn't a symbol of his reflexes. This was the locking bolt I had blown up to save his miserable life. He was carrying around a piece of my work. He was carrying around the physical evidence of his own helplessness and my competence, and he was too stupid to even know what it was. Well? Mark asked, impatient with my silence. Heavy, isn't it? Does it feel real enough for you? I looked up from the metal. I looked at Mark. For the first time all night, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I didn't feel the need to explain my job. I felt something much colder. I felt the hunter's instinct when the prey steps into the trap. It is heavy, I said softly, running my thumb over the jagged edge. And very specific. What's that supposed to mean? Mark frowned. It means, I said, setting the metal back down on the table with a precise, deliberate click, that this doesn't look like accidental debris, Mark. The shearing on the edge, it looks almost engineered, like a controlled demolition. Mark scoffed, waving his hand. What would you know about demolition, Elaine? Stick to your spreadsheets. That's chaos you're looking at. Pure chaos. If you say so, I murmured. But he wasn't done. He had established his dominance with the prop, and now he needed to twist the knife one last time. He needed to make sure I was completely humiliated, not just professionally, but fundamentally. He sat back, crossing his arms, a wicked grin spreading across his face. You know, he said, glancing at Uncle Jim and then back at me. It's a good thing that voice on the radio was a man, because honestly, if it had been a woman, we probably wouldn't have made it out. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Why is that? Laya asked, playing her part perfectly. Mark shrugged. Biology, babe, like I said. A woman would have seen that fire, heard us screaming. She would have cracked. She would have been puking all over her console. Women are great at nurturing, sure. But when it comes to the abyss, they just don't have the stomach for it. He looked at me, waiting for me to cry, waiting for me to run away. No offense, Elaine, he added with a wink. Just stating facts. I looked at the burnt metal. I looked at his smug face, and I decided. The invisible child was about to speak. It's nothing personal, Elaine, Mark said, leaning back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a man who believes he is teaching a class to slow learners. It's just Biology 101. He gestured with his empty wine glass, the red residue staining the crystal like dried blood. You see, he continued, evolution designed men and women differently. We are the hunters. We have the adrenaline dump, the tunnel vision, the aggression required to survive the kill zone. Women, you're designed to protect the nest, to nurture. It's a beautiful thing, really. But you put a nurturer in a meat grinder, the system crashes. I sat frozen. Not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of his ignorance. Take that night at Redport, Mark said, pointing a finger at the ceiling as if recalling a divine revelation. When that first tank ruptured, I saw a guy, one of the factory workers, stumble out with half his face melted off. It was gruesome. I mean, proper horror movie stuff. And you know what happened to my stomach? Nothing. Steel. He tapped his midsection proudly. But if a woman had been on the radio, if she had access to the visuals I was seeing, Mark shook his head, chuckling darkly. She would have been vomiting all over her console within 10 seconds. It's a reflex. You see blood, you see fire, and your body rejects it. You panic, you scream. It's hardwired into your DNA to flee, not to fight. Exactly, Uncle Jim chimed in, nodding sagely as he poured himself another glass of the cheap blend. It's not an insult, Elaine. It's just the natural order. Men take the hill, women keep the home fires burning. You can't ask a goldfish to climb a tree, right? Right, Aunt Carol agreed, looking at me with that same pitying expression she used when I was single at Christmas. Mark is just saying that everyone has a role, dear. Yours is safe. And that's okay. We need people to be safe. I felt a coldness spreading through my limbs. It wasn't the draft from the patio door anymore. It was the icy clarity of detachment. I looked at Mark. I looked at his hands. Soft, manicured, shaking slightly from the alcohol. I looked at his eyes, glassy and desperate for validation. He wasn't just insulting me. He was insulting every woman I'd ever served with. He was spitting on the graves of female medics who died dragging men twice their size out of Humvees in Kandahar. He was mocking the female pilots who rained hellfire down on insurgent positions while he was probably playing Call of Duty in his fraternity house. But the worst cut was yet to come. Laya, sensing that I was cornered, decided to deliver the coup de grace. She didn't want to be left out of the bashing. Plus, Laya giggled, twirling a lock of her blonde hair. Can you imagine Elaine in a war zone? Seriously? She looked around the table, inviting everyone to share the joke. I mean, look at her, Laya continued, gesturing at my outfit. A simple gray cardigan and slacks. Elaine, have you ever even seen real blood? I don't mean a paper cut. I mean blood. She leaned in, her eyes glinting with malice. Or is the only red thing you see all day the red ink you use to correct spelling mistakes on your memos? The table erupted. It wasn't a polite titter. It was a full-blown guffaw. Uncle Jim slapped the table. Mark threw his head back, laughing so hard he nearly choked on his wine. Even Aunt Carol covered her mouth to hide a smile. Red ink, Mark gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. Oh, that's rich, Laya. That's perfect. Red ink versus red blood. That sums it up right there. I sat there, completely still. Inside my head, the noise of their laughter faded away. It was replaced by a low, steady hum. It was the sound of my training taking over. Threat assessment. High. Target status. Hostile. Rules of engagement. Green. I remembered the blood. I remembered the arterial spray of a cartel sicario in Juarez. I remembered the dark, pooling blood of a hostage in Yemen. I remembered the blood of my own instructor during a live fire exercise gone wrong. I had seen more blood before I was 25 than everyone at this table combined would see in 10 lifetimes. I had smelled it. I had waded through it. I had washed it out of my hair in a cold shower on a base in the middle of nowhere, watching the water turn pink and swirling down the drain. And here was Laya, a woman whose biggest crisis this year was a chipped nail, asking me if I knew what red looked like. My heart rate, which had spiked briefly during the initial insult, began to drop. 100 BPM, 80 BPM, 60 BPM, 55 BPM. I entered the zone. It's a state of mind every operator knows. The world slows down. Emotions, anger, sadness, embarrassment are boxed up and shoved into a mental locker to be dealt with later. What remains is pure, crystalline focus. I looked at Mark. He wasn't my cousin's fiancé anymore. He was a hostile asset spreading disinformation. He was a compromised element. I looked at the jagged piece of metal on the table. The souvenir. They wanted a show. They wanted to know about the man on the radio. They wanted to talk about fire and blood. Fine. I know a lot of you listening right now are boiling with rage. I can feel it. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, more infuriating than being told you are too weak or too emotional by someone who wouldn't last 5 minutes in your shoes. If you are ready to see Elaine tear this man's ego apart piece by piece, hit that like button right now. Do it for every time you've been underestimated. And I want you to comment below. Just type one word. Respect. Type it for the women who serve, for the quiet professionals, and for anyone who has ever had to sit in silence while a fool speaks. Let's flood the comments with respect before the storm hits. The laughter at the table began to die down, trailing off into a few stray chuckles. They noticed the change. It started with Uncle Jim. He stopped laughing and frowned, looking at me with a sudden unease. Then Laya's smile faltered. I hadn't moved. I hadn't frowned. I hadn't cried. I was staring at Mark with what we call the 1,000-yard stare. It's a look that looks through you, past you, to the chaotic entropy of the universe behind you. It's the look of someone who has decided how you are going to end. Mark cleared his throat. The silence stretched out, becoming uncomfortable. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What?" Mark asked, his voice losing its bravado, shifting into defensiveness. "Cat got your tongue, Elaine, or did the thought of all that blood make you faint?" I slowly reached out and picked up my knife and fork. I didn't pick them up to eat. I held them for a second, feeling the weight, and then I set them down on the edge of my plate. Clang. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and final. It sounded like the bolt of a rifle sliding home. I lifted my head. I didn't blink. "You mentioned the radio, Mark," I said. My voice was different. It wasn't the soft, polite voice of Elaine, the office clerk. It was deeper, resonant, controlled from the diaphragm. It carried a weight that vibrated the water in the glasses. "You said the voice was a man," I continued, locking eyes with him, "because only a man could handle the fire." "Yeah," Mark stammered, shifting in his seat, his eyes darting around. That's what I said." "Interesting," I said. I leaned forward, crossing my arms on the table, invading his personal space from across the centerpiece. "Tell me, Mark," I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "If that man was such a brother to you, if you were so in sync, why don't you tell everyone here what his call sign was?" Mark blinked. "His what?" "His call sign," I repeated. "Every operator has one. You were connected by brotherhood, right? You were dancing in the fire together, so surely you remember the unit ID he used to authenticate the extraction protocol." The room was dead silent. The wind outside howled, but inside you could hear a pin drop. Mark opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The trap was set, the safety was off, and I was about to pull the trigger. The sound of my knife and fork hitting the fine china was not loud, but in that dining room, it echoed like a gavel striking a judge's bench. Clink, clatter. I withdrew my hands from the table and placed them calmly in my lap. I sat back. I didn't slouch. I didn't shrink. I straightened my spine, engaging the posture I used during debriefings with Joint Chiefs. The laughter that had filled the room only seconds ago didn't just fade, it was severed. It was as if someone had cut the power cord to a radio. The only sound left was the relentless howling of the Minnesota blizzard battering the sliding glass doors, a low, mournful moan that emphasized the sudden, suffocating silence inside the house. Aunt Carol blinked, her smile freezing in place, a confused rictus of forced hospitality. Uncle Jim lowered his wine glass, a drop of red liquid running down the side, staining his thumb. Laya's smirk twitched, faltering as she looked at me. She was waiting for me to cry, or to storm out, or to apologize for ruining the mood. She wasn't expecting me to just sit there. But I wasn't looking at them. My entire world had narrowed down to a single focal point. Mark. I locked eyes with him. In my line of work, we call it acquiring the target. It's a specific kind of gaze. It's not angry. Anger is messy. Anger makes you sloppy. This gaze is clinical. It's the way a surgeon looks at a tumor, or the way a wolf looks at a deer that has wandered too far from the herd. It is the look of someone who knows exactly how the next 30 seconds are going to play out, while the other person is still trying to figure out the rules of the game. Mark stopped chewing. He swallowed hard, the food visibly struggling to go down a throat that had suddenly gone dry. He tried to hold my gaze, tried to summon that arrogant alpha bravado he had been wearing all night like a cheap costume. He puffed out his chest. He narrowed his eyes, but he couldn't hold it. I saw the micro expressions flickering across his face, confusion, annoyance. And then, creeping in around the edges like frost on a window pane. Fear. He felt it. He didn't know what it was, but his primitive lizard brain was screaming at him that something was wrong. The predator in the room wasn't him. Elaine? Aunt Carol's voice broke the silence, shrill and nervous. Is everything all right? You look intense. I'm fine, Aunt Carol, I said. I didn't turn my head to look at her. I didn't break eye contact with Mark. Inside my chest, I felt a familiar sensation. It was the weight of the badge I kept in my desk drawer in D.C. It was the weight of the oath I'd taken 10 years ago, standing in a sterile government room with my right hand raised. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Most people think that oath is just words, a formality to get a paycheck. But for those of us who sit in the dark, watching the world burn on high-definition monitors, that oath is the only thing that separates us from the monsters. We defend the truth. We defend reality. And right now, sitting across from me, was an enemy of the truth, a domestic enemy of integrity, a man building a castle on a foundation of stolen valor and lies, using the suffering of brave men and women as mortar for his ego. I couldn't let it stand. Not tonight. Not ever again. You asked me a question, Mark, I said. My voice had changed. The office mouse squeak was gone. I dropped my register, engaging my diaphragm, projecting the sound with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in the chest. It was the command voice, the voice that cuts through panic, the voice that makes grown men stop running and listen. You asked if I had ever seen blood, I continued, my words precise and clipped. You asked if the thought of it made me faint. Mark laughed, but it was a brittle, hollow sound. Come on, Elaine, can't take a joke. We're just having a little fun. Fun, I repeated. The word tasted like ash. I leaned forward slowly, resting my elbows on the table, invading his personal space from 5 feet away. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. You told us a very compelling story about Redport, Mark, I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. You told us about the fire, the chaos, the brotherhood, and you told us about the man on the radio, the ghost, the one you shared a soul bond with. Yeah, Mark said, shifting in his seat, loosening his tie with a finger. So? You said you were in sync, I said. 2 warriors dancing in the fire. Those were your words, right? That's right, Mark said, his chin jutting out defiantly. We were. Then you know the protocol, I said. The what? The protocol, I said, sharper this time. The DHS communication protocol for Tier 1 emergencies. When a field commander, which you claim you were, establishes a direct link with a remote operator during a comms blackout, there is a handshake procedure. It's the first thing you do. It's automatic. It's drilled into you until you can say it in your sleep. I saw a bead of sweat form on Mark's hairline. He wiped it away quickly. We didn't have time for bureaucracy, Elaine, he scoffed, trying to regain the upper hand. We were dying. We skipped the formalities. You never skip authentication, I said. Not when you're calling in a remote detonation for a blast door. You can't just ask for a door to be blown, Mark. You have to authorize it. You have to prove you are who you say you are. Laya looked back and forth between us, her brow furrowed. Elaine, what are you talking about? Why does this matter? It matters, I said, never taking my eyes off Mark. Because a hero never forgets the name of the man who saved his life. And in the tactical world, our name is our number. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down. So, Mark, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that roared in the silence. I'll ask you again. If that man on the radio was your brother, if he was the only one who understood you, surely you remember his call sign? Surely you remember the unit ID for your own team. Mark froze. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked at Laya, then at Uncle Jim, looking for an exit ramp. It was chaotic, Mark stammered, his face flushing a deep, blotchy red. There was interference, static. We didn't use call signs, we just talked. You just talked, I repeated flatly. On an encrypted military channel, in a hazmat zone. Yes, Mark snapped, slamming his hand on the table, trying to bully his way out of the corner. Jesus, Elaine, why are you grilling me? It's a bunch of numbers. Who cares? I saved the team. That's what matters. The numbers matter, Mark, I said. I stood up. I didn't rush. I unfolded myself from the small metal folding chair, rising to my full height. I'm not a short woman, but in that moment, I felt 10 feet tall. I looked down at him. The numbers matter, I said, because they are the only truth in a room full of lies. I reached into my memory palace. I unlocked the file labeled Redport Incident 02 hours. I saw the data stream as clearly as if it were projected on the wall behind him. You don't know the number, I said, answering for him. You don't know the call sign. You don't even know the frequency. You're crazy, Mark muttered, looking at Aunt Carol. She's drunk, or off her meds. Carol, get her to sit down. I'm not the one who needs to sit down, Mark, I said. I took a breath. And then, I did something I had never done in my civilian life. I let the operator out. Unit Delta 9, I recited, my voice changing cadence, becoming the mechanical, rhythmic voice of the radio. Grid coordinates 45-3 north, 93.2 west, Sector 4. Oxidizing agent detected. Structure integrity critical. Mark's head snapped up. His eyes went wide. His face drained of color so fast it looked like the blood had been sucked out of him by a vacuum. How? He whispered. How do you know the coordinates? I leaned in, bracing my hands on the table, looming over him like the judgment of God. I know them, I said, because I was the one who typed them in. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It pressed down on the table like a physical weight, suffocating the soft jazz playlist that was still cycling through the speakers in the background. Mark was staring at me. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide and unblinking, vibrating with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The coordinates I had just recited, 45.3 north, 93.2 west, hung in the air between us like smoke from a gunshot. I didn't keep standing over him. I had made my point. Now it was time for the execution. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered myself back into the metal folding chair. It creaked under my weight, a sharp, ugly sound that made Aunt Carol flinch. I picked up my linen napkin, shook it out with a snap, and placed it back on my lap. Then, I picked up my knife and fork. I looked down at my prime rib. It had gone cold, the au jus congealing slightly on the china. It didn't matter. I wasn't eating for pleasure anymore. I was eating to demonstrate control. I sliced a piece of meat. The silver knife glided through the beef. Ambient temperature, I said, my voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, rising to 1,500 near the chemical vats. Mark took a stumbling step back, his legs hitting the edge of his chair. He gripped the back of it for support. Who? He croaked, his voice cracking. Who gave you the after-action report? Did you hack my laptop? That's classified data, Elaine. That's a felony. I put the meat in my mouth. I chewed slowly, looking him dead in the eye. I swallowed. There is no after-action report that detailed, Mark, I said. You wrote the report, and I know you left out the temperature readings because you were too busy hyperventilating to check your HUD. Liar! Laya shrieked. The sudden noise made Uncle Jim jump. Laya was standing now, her face twisted in defense of her crumbling hero. You're lying. Mark is a hero. You're just jealous because you're a miserable, lonely spinster who makes up stories. Am I? I asked softly. I turned my gaze to Mark. He looked sick. He looked like a man who was watching a ghost crawl out of his television screen. Let's talk about or 2:14 a.m., I said. Mark flinched. He knew the time. Every soldier knows the time they thought they were going to die. The radio log, I continued, slicing another piece of potato. You told everyone here that the comms went down. You told them about the silence. But that's not true, is it? Shut up, Mark whispered. It was a plea, not a command. The comms were live, I said, relentless. I heard the wind. I heard the fire roaring like a jet engine. And I heard you. I leaned forward, dropping my voice to a mocking, high-pitched whimper, perfectly mimicking the sound of a terrified man crying for his life. Oh God, I can't see. My eyes, I don't want to die. Mom. Mommy, please, I'm sorry. The impersonation was brutal. It was raw. It was the sound of pure, undiluted cowardice. Aunt Carol gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Uncle Jim looked at Mark, waiting for him to deny it, waiting for him to punch me. But Mark just stood there, gray and shaking, sweat beading on his upper lip. That's not... Mark stammered. You're making it up. And then, I said, returning to my normal voice, you froze. You were in the middle of the kill zone, Sector 4. The structural beams were groaning. The roof was coming down. You were curled up in a ball behind a forklift, sobbing into your mic. Stop it, Laya screamed, grabbing a wine bottle, as if to throw it. Stop lying. Mark said there was a man, a hero. He said a man saved him. Yes, I said. He did say that. I set my knife and fork down. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I centered myself. I visualized the Tactical Operations Center. I visualized the headset pressing against my ears. I visualized the waveform on the audio monitor. I engaged the diaphragm. I dropped the larynx. I stripped away the Elaine, the niece, the cousin, the woman. I became the operator. When I opened my eyes, they were black holes. Delta 9, I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a rumble. It was a voice that didn't belong in a dining room. It was deep, gravelly, and layered with the kind of absolute, terrifying authority that overrides the instinct for self-preservation. It was the voice of a 50-year-old chain-smoking colonel. It was the voice Mark had fallen in love with. Mark's head snapped up. His eyes went wide, the pupils dilating until they swallowed the irises. I continued, the voice rolling out of me like thunder. Delta 9, cease transmission. Shut your mouth and turn left immediately. Mark stopped breathing. He wasn't looking at Elaine anymore. He was hearing the ghost. Door B3 will blow in 3 seconds. Get on your feet, soldier. Move, move, move. The last word hit the room like a physical shockwave. Crash. The crystal wine glass slipped from Mark's trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, the floor Aunt Carol was so worried about, and exploded. Shards of glass flew across the room. Red wine splattered onto Mark's expensive Italian shoes and up the leg of his trousers, looking for all the world like a fresh arterial bleed. But nobody looked at the mess. Every single pair of eyes was locked on me. Mark was shaking so hard his teeth were actually chattering. He looked at me, and for the first time, he really saw me. He didn't see the cardigan. He didn't see the office lady. He saw the person who had held his life in the palm of her hand while he cried for his mother. It was you, Mark whispered. The sound was barely audible over the wind outside. The voice. The ghost. It was you. It's called tactical modulation, Mark, I said, my voice returning to its normal, cool alto. I picked up my glass of water and took a sip. It's a basic level 5 skill. We use it to calm down hysterical assets in the field. Assets who lose their nerve. Assets like you. Laya slumped back into her chair, her mouth hanging open. She looked from Mark to me and back to Mark. The hero narrative she had built her entire wedding around was dissolving in real time. You? Laya stammered, looking at her fiancé with a dawning look of revulsion. You cried for your mom? Mark didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off me. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been bullying a sleeping tiger for 3 hours, and the tiger just woke up. And that piece of metal? I pointed to the jagged scrap still sitting on the tablecloth. That's the bolt from the door I blew open for you, because you were too busy crying to punch in the code. I leaned back, crossing my legs. So, I asked, looking around the silent, shattered room. Who else wants to talk about how women can't handle the fire? Mark looked like he was having a stroke. He was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles were white, as if the table was the only thing tethering him to the earth. His face, usually flushed with alcohol and arrogance, was now a sickly, pale gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out, just a dry, clicking rasp. The illusion was shattering. You could almost hear it breaking, like the sound of ice cracking under too much weight. It's you, Mark finally whispered. His voice trembled, stripping away the deep, confident baritone he had faked all evening. The voice. The ghost. It was... you? He looked at me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. It wasn't just that I knew the coordinates, it was the sound. When I had dropped my voice into that tactical register, I had triggered his muscle memory. I had transported him back to the worst moment of his life, and in that moment, he recognized his savior. I can't believe it, he mumbled, shaking his head. I swore it was a man, a ranger, a brother. You heard what you wanted to hear, Mark, I said, leaning back in my chair, my pulse steady. You needed a hero to validate your own delusion, so your brain invented one. But the person who walked you through that fire, the person who told you when to breathe and where to step, that was me. That was the office clerk you've been laughing at for 3 hours. No, Laya gasped. She was standing up, her hands clutching her napkin. She looked frantically between me and Mark. This isn't true. Mark, tell her she's lying. You led the team. You said you saved them. Mark didn't answer her. He couldn't even look at her. He was staring at the red wine soaking into his pants, paralyzed by the sudden, violent exposure of his own fraudulence. He didn't lead anyone, Laya, I said calmly. He followed, like a lost child. But the fire, Mark stammered, his eyes darting around the room, desperate to salvage a scrap of his dignity. The things I saw, the bodies, I told you. I told you about the stomach, about the biology. A woman couldn't handle that. You would have been sick. He was clinging to his misogyny like a life raft. It was pathetic. I let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a nice laugh. Let's talk about biology, Mark, I said, since you're such an expert. I picked up my water glass again, inspecting the condensation on the rim. You made a big point earlier about how women are biologically programmed to vomit when they see trauma, I said. You said we're weak. You said we don't have the stomach for the abyss. Yeah, Mark breathed, seizing on the point. Yeah, exactly. That's why it had to be a guy. I pulled the medical logs from the triage unit this morning, I said. The color drained from his face even further, if that was possible. Standard procedure for a hazmat extraction, I explained to the room. Every member of the team is evaluated immediately. I have the EMT report for patient 0, that's you, Mark, right on my secure server. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone could hear. The report states that upon extraction, the subject was in a state of catatonic shock. It also notes that the subject had soiled himself. Leia made a choking sound. Uncle Jim's jaw actually dropped. And the vomiting, I continued, relentless. The report says you had aspirated vomit in your airway. You were the only one, Mark. Out of 12 men, you were the only one who threw up all over yourself. The female medic who intubated you, she was fine. She cleaned you up. I paused, letting the image sink in. So you were right, I said. Someone did vomit when they saw the fire. It just wasn't the woman on the radio. It was the hero on the ground. Oh my God, Laya whispered. She looked at Mark with a dawn of pure revulsion. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't concern. It was disgust. She had spent months building her brand around being the future wife of a decorated hero. She had posted about it on Instagram. She had bragged to her friends. And now she was standing next to a man who pissed his pants and cried for his mommy while her cousin, the boring cousin, did the actual work. You lied to me, Laya hissed. Her voice rose to a shriek. You told me you were a warrior. You told me you carried your team out. I did. I survived, Mark pleaded, reaching for her hand. Laya slapped his hand away. Don't touch me. You're a fraud, Mark. A total fraud. She wasn't angry that he had trauma. She was angry that he had embarrassed her. She was angry that her trophy husband turned out to be a cheap plastic knockoff. Laya, please, Mark begged, looking small and broken. It was It was the fog of war. Memories get mixed up. Stop it, Laya screamed. She grabbed her purse from the chair. Just stop talking. You're humiliating me. In the corner, Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim were sitting like statues. They looked shell-shocked. They had spent the entire evening insulting me, belittling my career, and treating me like a second-class citizen in favor of this man. And now they realized that the person who saved their future son-in-law's life was the person they had put at the kids' table. Uncle Jim stared at his wine glass, unable to meet my eyes. Aunt Carol was wringing her hands, looking terrified, as if I might suddenly call in an airstrike on the kitchen. I think dinner is over, I said. I stood up. My legs felt strong. The cold draft from the patio door didn't bother me anymore. The cold was inside the room now, radiating from the shattered remains of Mark's ego. I looked at the table, specifically at the object sitting in front of my plate, the jagged black piece of metal. Mark's lucky charm. I'll take this, I said. I reached out and picked up the fragment of the Sector B3 blast door. It was heavy in my hand, cold steel. Mark flinched as I took it, as if I were stealing his soul. That's mine, he whispered weakly. It's my souvenir. No, Mark, I said, slipping the metal into my handbag. A souvenir is something you earn. You didn't earn this. You survived it. I looked him up and down one last time. He looked like a ruined man. His suit was stained with wine. His face was stained with shame. His fiancée was looking at him with hatred. This metal is from the door I opened, I said. I calculated the charge. I typed the code. I cleared the path. This is my work, and I don't leave my work in the hands of amateurs. I zipped my bag shut. The sound was final. You can keep the wine stain, I said. It suits you. I turned my back on him. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. The mission was accomplished. The target was neutralized. The truth had been extracted. As I walked toward the hallway to get my coat, I heard Leia start to sob. Ugly, angry tears of a narcissist who realized the spotlight had shifted. I heard Mark trying to stammer an apology to Uncle Jim. But I didn't look back. An operator never looks back at the explosion. The only sound left in the dining room was the wind. It battered against the sliding glass doors with renewed fury, a relentless, howling force that seemed determined to scrub the house clean of the lies that had just been spilled inside. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. It wasn't the awkward, suffocating silence that had greeted me when I arrived 4 hours ago. This was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of a battlefield after the artillery has stopped firing. It was the silence of total devastation. Mark was still slumped in his chair, staring at the ruin of his wineglass. Laya was sobbing quietly into her hands, her shoulders shaking. Not with sorrow for her fiancé, I suspected, but with self-pity for the public embarrassment she was already calculating how to spin. Uncle Jim and Aunt Carol sat frozen, pale, and diminished, like wax figures that had been left too close to a fire. I picked up my linen napkin from the table. The fabric was heavy, starched, and expensive, just like everything else in this house. I dabbed the corners of my mouth with slow, deliberate precision, folding the napkin neatly before placing it beside my untouched plate. The steak was a little tough, Aunt Carol, I said. My voice was soft, polite, the perfect picture of Midwest manners. Maybe a bit overcooked, just like Mark's story. Aunt Carol flinched as if I'd slapped her. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a reflex apology or a defense, but no words came out. There were no words left. The script she had followed for 30 years, the one where Elaine was the failure and the family was perfect, had been shredded. I reached for my handbag. I unzipped the side pocket, the metallic zzz zip cutting through the quiet room. I took one last look at the table, ensuring that the jagged black piece of steel from Sector B3 was safely tucked inside. I'm taking this back, I said, patting the bag. Don't worry, Mark. You can keep the memories. I hear trauma bonds are very trendy these days. I turned away from the table. I didn't rush. I didn't storm out. I walked with the easy, fluid stride of someone who has nothing to hide and nowhere to run from. My heels clicked rhythmically on the hardwood floor, the floor Aunt Carol loved more than her own niece, marking time as I moved toward the foyer. Behind me, I heard a chair scrape back. "Elaine, wait," Uncle Jim's voice called out. It was weak, stripped of its earlier bluster. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I reached the foyer and pulled my wool coat from the rack, burying myself in its familiar, scratchy warmth. I wound my scarf around my neck, pulling it tight. I buttoned the coat all the way to the chin. I was armoring up, preparing to re-enter the element that Mark claimed I couldn't handle. I put my hand on the brass doorknob. The metal was freezing cold, conducting the temperature from outside. It felt grounding. I opened the door. The storm hit me instantly. The wind roared into the entryway, bringing a swirl of snowflakes that danced over the expensive rug. It was chaotic, violent, and absolutely beautiful. It was real. Unlike the air inside that house, which was recycled and stale, this air tasted of ozone and ice. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The latch clicked. It was a solid, final sound. A period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I walked down the driveway, my boots crunching deep into the fresh snow. The blizzard was in full force now. Visibility was down to maybe 10 feet. Most people would be terrified to drive in this. They would see danger. They would see a threat. I just saw weather. Just another variable to calculate. I reached my 10-year-old Ford sedan. It was buried under a layer of white, looking like a snowdrift in the shape of a car. I brushed the snow off the driver's side door and slid inside. The leather seats were freezing, stiff against my back. The air inside the cabin was frigid, smelling faintly of old coffee and cold dust. It was the most comfortable I had felt all night. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, protested for a second against the cold, and then roared to life. The heater kicked on, blowing icy air that would take 10 minutes to warm up. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I looked up at the rearview mirror. Through the swirling snow, I could see the glowing windows of the lake house. Frame by frame, I could see them moving inside. I saw Laya gesticulating wildly, screaming at Mark. I saw Aunt Carol sinking onto the sofa, her face in her hands. They looked so small. From out here, in the dark, they looked like actors on a tiny stage, performing a tragedy that no one was watching anymore. I wasn't the invisible child anymore. I realized that now. I had never been invisible. I was just operating on a frequency they didn't have the hardware to receive. My phone, mounted on the dashboard, buzzed. The screen lit up, cutting through the gloom of the car. It wasn't a text from my mother asking why I left early. It wasn't a text from Laya demanding an apology. It was a push notification from the DHS Secure Comm app. The icon was a simple, nondescript shield. I tapped the screen. The message opened, black text on a gray background. Priority: Alpha Sender, Central Command, First Store, DC. Status: Active message, new assignment. Hostage situation developing in Seattle. Local assets compromised. We need a lead operator on the comms immediately. Are you ready? I stared at the screen. Seattle. Another crisis. Another fire. Another set of lives hanging by a thread, waiting for a voice in the dark to tell them where to step. They didn't care about my hardwood floors. They didn't care about my car. They didn't care if I was single or married or the disappointment of the family. They cared that I was the best. I tapped the reply button. My fingers moved automatically, typing the only 2 words that mattered. Always ready. I hit send. I put the car in reverse, backing out of the driveway. I shifted into drive. The headlights cut 2 twin beams through the white chaos ahead. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the warmth I was leaving behind. I pressed the gas pedal, and my car surged forward, merging onto the unplowed road, disappearing into the heart of the storm where I belonged. Because Mark was wrong about one thing. The storm isn't something you hide from. The storm is where the work gets done. Before I go, I want to share something important that I learned tonight. For years, I let my family's opinion define my reality. I thought that if I stayed quiet and worked hard, eventually they would see me. But tonight proved that you cannot force people to respect you if they are committed to misunderstanding you. Your value does not decrease based on someone else's inability to see your worth. True strength isn't about bragging at a dinner table, it's about doing the right thing when no one is watching. If you are feeling invisible right now, remember, you don't need their applause. You just need to trust your own competence. The only validation that matters is the one you see in the mirror. Now, I want to hear from you. I know I'm not the only one who has sat at a kid's table while being the most capable person in the room. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member or a partner like Mark to save your own sanity? Share your story in the comments below. Your courage might inspire someone else to finally walk away. And if you enjoyed seeing the truth finally explode tonight, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Help us build a community where the quiet warriors finally get a voice. Stay safe, stay strong, and I'll see you on the next mission.